A bulldozer from the Homeowners Association crushed the old well shed on Daniel Brooks's property while the board members clapped from the sidewalk. They called it an eyesore that was dragging down the value of the neighborhood. Daniel did not try to stop them. He simply stood at the edge of his gravel driveway, watched the walls fold inward like paper, and then quietly reached into the wreckage to pull out the last operating key to the system buried beneath it. 2 days later, more than 400 homes ran completely dry at the same time. There was no water for showers, no water to drink, and no water for the fire trucks that would soon be needed. When the whole community finally panicked and started asking who was responsible, they discovered that the shed they had destroyed had been the beating heart of the only water supply the town had relied on for almost 30 years. Daniel Brooks lived a quiet life on the edge of Willow Creek Estates, in a modest single-story house that had belonged to his father before him. He kept to himself, rose early, and spent most mornings walking the perimeter of his land with a thermos of black coffee in one hand. Every single day, without fail, he would stop at a small wooden shed near the back fence, unlock the door, and step inside for exactly the same amount of time. The shed looked rough from the outside, with peeling gray paint and a slightly crooked roofline that had never been repaired. His neighbors assumed it was nothing more than a place where an old man kept rusty tools and forgotten furniture. None of them had any idea what was actually humming beneath that structure. Underneath the warped floorboards sat a deep bore well drilled decades earlier, connected to an industrial-grade pump that never stopped working. Beside the pump ran a filtration system that cleaned the water before it ever touched a single pipe in the neighborhood, and past that stood a distribution valve that quietly sent that same water branching out toward hundreds of homes. The whole arrangement had been feeding Willow Creek Estates since long before most of its current residents had ever heard of the town, built in a decade when the land was still mostly open fields and cattle fencing. The town itself sat in a stretch of dry country where rainfall had grown scarcer with every passing year, and a drought that had lasted longer than anyone cared to admit had already strained reservoirs across the region. Lawns elsewhere had turned brown, restrictions on outdoor watering had become routine, and neighboring communities had grown accustomed to rationing schedules posted outside their town halls. Willow Creek Estates, by comparison, had always seemed strangely unaffected by these hardships, its lawns staying green and its faucets running steady, even during the driest months of summer. Residents had long assumed this was simply good fortune, or perhaps a quirk of the municipal water grid that happened to favor their particular corner of the county, never once suspecting that the real explanation was buried quietly beneath a shed nobody thought twice about. Daniel maintained every piece of it without pay, without recognition, and without ever mentioning it to a single member of the board. He did it because his father had asked him to, years earlier, in a will that laid out the responsibility in plain language alongside the deed to the land. The agreement was old, handwritten in places, and tucked away in a filing cabinet that nobody at the Homeowners Association had ever bothered to request. Daniel simply kept showing up, checking pressure gauges, greasing bearings, and replacing filters, the same way his father had done before him for nearly 3 decades. He never advertised what he was doing, and he never asked for thanks, because the arrangement had always worked exactly as intended. Water flowed, showers ran, gardens stayed green even during the driest months, and nobody ever had to think about where any of it came from. That silence, that complete invisibility, was by design, since his father had always believed that the best infrastructure was the kind nobody noticed until it was gone. Daniel had inherited that same philosophy along with the land, and he carried it forward without complaint, year after year, long after his father had passed. There had been a woman once, years earlier, who had asked him directly why he spent so much of his time tending a shed that seemed to serve no purpose at all. Daniel had smiled at the question, telling her only that some things mattered more quietly than others, and that not everything worth protecting needed an audience to justify it. She had not understood the answer then, and had eventually moved away to a different town, leaving Daniel alone with the same routine he had always kept. He never resented that solitude, since the work itself had become its own kind of companionship, a daily ritual that connected him to a father he still missed more than he ever said aloud. Every gauge he checked and every filter he replaced felt like a conversation continued across the years, one neither death nor time had managed to interrupt. The neighborhood around him, meanwhile, was changing in ways that had little to do with pipes or pumps. The Homeowners Association had grown stricter with every passing year, tightening rules about paint colors, lawn heights, and the placement of trash bins on collection day. A new leadership had taken over the board, one far more concerned with appearances than with anything happening underground, and that leadership was about to collide directly with the quiet man who had spent his whole life protecting something nobody else even knew existed. Victoria Sterling had been president of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association for exactly 3 years when she first noticed Daniel Brooks's shed during a routine property inspection. She was a woman in her early 50s who dressed as though every day required a photograph, favoring tailored blazers and heels, even on weekend walks through the neighborhood. Rules were her language, and she spoke it fluently, treating every regulation in the association handbook as though it carried the weight of federal law. Victoria genuinely believed that a well-maintained facade was the single most important factor in a neighborhood's success, more important than schools, more important than crime rates, more important than anything happening behind closed doors. To her, an ugly structure sitting in plain view was practically a personal insult, a visible symbol of neglect that reflected poorly on every homeowner nearby. When she spotted Daniel's shed from the street one afternoon, its peeling paint and crooked roof struck her as exactly the kind of blemish she had been elected to eliminate. Before joining the board, Victoria had spent years working in real estate, and she often reminded anyone willing to listen that first impressions determined nearly everything about a buyer's decision. She kept a folder on her office computer filled with photographs of front yards she considered unacceptable, updating it constantly as she drove through the neighborhood on her daily rounds. Overgrown hedges, faded mailboxes, and mismatched shutters all earned a place in that folder, each one accompanied by a note detailing exactly which bylaw had been violated. Daniel's shed, once she noticed it, quickly became the centerpiece of her collection, a structure she considered so offensive that she began mentioning it during casual conversations with other board members, weeks before sending any official notice. She sent her first letter within the week, a formal notice printed on association letterhead demanding that the structure be repaired or removed within 30 days. Daniel read it carefully at his kitchen table, folded it once, and set it aside without much reaction, since he had received similar letters from previous board members over the years. He assumed, reasonably enough, that a short conversation would clear up any misunderstanding, and he drove over to the clubhouse the following afternoon to speak with Victoria directly. Their conversation did not go the way he had hoped. Victoria sat behind her desk with her hands folded neatly in front of her, listening to him with an expression that suggested she was simply waiting for her turn to speak rather than actually absorbing anything he said. When Daniel told her, calmly and without exaggeration, that the building mattered more than she realized, she let out a short laugh and told him that everyone had an excuse for why their eyesore should be allowed to stay. She followed the letter with a fine, then another fine, each one larger than the last, along with a formal request that the structure be demolished entirely rather than repaired. Daniel tried again to explain, telling her plainly that the shed was not simply storage, that removing it would create problems far beyond what she was imagining. Victoria waved a hand dismissively and told him that she had heard every excuse in the book from homeowners trying to protect their clutter, and that this would be no different. She was, in her own mind, protecting the integrity of the neighborhood, defending property values on behalf of every family who had trusted the association to keep standards high. What she failed to grasp, standing there in her pressed blazer with her clipboard of violations, was that the man across from her was not exaggerating in the slightest, and that the quiet warning he kept repeating was the only mercy she would receive before the consequences arrived on their own. Daniel tried a second time before leaving her office that day, choosing his words carefully in the hope that a different approach might finally land. He told her that he was not asking for a favor, only for a moment of patience while he explained something that concerned every single household in the development, not just his own property line. Victoria checked her watch, told him she had another appointment waiting, and assured him that the association's decision would stand regardless of whatever story he was preparing to tell. She stood, extended a brisk handshake, and walked him to the door, with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned long ago how to end a conversation she considered already settled. Victoria called a special meeting of the Homeowners Association within 2 weeks, determined to bring the matter of Daniel Brooks's shed before the entire board and a good portion of the neighborhood. She arrived early to set up a projector, cycling through photographs she had taken herself, each one framed to make the structure look as decrepit and shameful as possible. When the room filled with residents, many of them curious about why an old shed warranted an entire meeting, Victoria began her presentation with the confidence of someone who had already decided the outcome. She clicked through image after image, narrating each one with a tone of practiced outrage, describing peeling paint, a warped door, and a roofline she compared to a collapsing tent. A few residents chuckled at the photographs, nudging each other and whispering that the whole thing seemed like an overreaction to a building nobody had ever paid attention to before. One neighbor, an older man named Walter, who had lived in the community for over a decade, raised his hand and pointed out that it was, after all, just a shed, tucked away where almost nobody could see it from the street. Victoria did not appreciate the pushback, and she straightened her posture before delivering what she clearly considered her closing argument. She told the room that if they allowed structures like this to remain standing, property values across the entire neighborhood would begin to slide, and that buyers touring homes nearby would notice every flaw no matter how hidden it seemed. Several board members nodded along, nodding not because they had inspected anything themselves, but because Victoria's certainty was, as usual, persuasive enough to fill the gaps in their own knowledge. Daniel sat quietly near the back of the room throughout the entire presentation, saying nothing, his expression unreadable to anyone glancing his way. When the board finally called for a vote, hands rose quickly around the room, the motion passing with an overwhelming majority in favor of the association's plan to remove the structure. Victoria smiled as the tally was announced, thanking everyone for their support and promising that the neighborhood would look better within the month. Not one person in that room, including every board member who voted in favor, asked to see the inside of the shed before making their decision. Nobody requested a survey of the property, nobody called the utility companies, and nobody thought to check whether removing an old wooden structure might have consequences beyond the way the street looked from a passing car. That single oversight, so small and so ordinary at the time, would turn out to be the first domino in a chain of events that none of them could yet imagine, the mistake from which everything else would eventually unravel. As the meeting broke up and residents filed out toward the parking lot, a woman named Emma Whitfield lingered near the doorway, glancing back toward Daniel with an expression that suggested she, at least, had some private reservations about what had just happened. She had lived 2 houses down from him for several years and had always found him pleasant enough, if a little private, and something about the ease with which the vote had passed struck her as unsettling. She considered saying something to Victoria on her way out, then decided against it, telling herself that the board surely knew what it was doing, and that raising the matter further would only make her look foolish in front of her neighbors. That small hesitation, ordinary as it seemed at the time, would stay with her long after the water stopped running, a quiet regret she would carry through everything that followed. The demolition crew arrived on a bright Tuesday morning, their yellow bulldozer rolling slowly down the street, trailed by a flatbed truck carrying additional equipment. Victoria had arranged everything herself, hiring a local contractor who specialized in clearing unwanted structures, and she stood near the curb that morning wearing sunglasses and a look of quiet satisfaction. Daniel walked out to meet the crew before they began, his hands in his pockets, his voice steady as he addressed the foreman standing beside the idling machine. He asked only one question, delivered without anger or theatrics, simply looking the man in the eye and saying that he wanted to be certain everyone understood exactly what they were about to do. The foreman glanced toward Victoria, who was already signing paperwork on a clipboard someone had handed her, and shrugged in a way that suggested the decision had long since left his hands. Victoria finished her signature with a flourish, handed the clipboard back, and told the crew to proceed exactly as planned, since the association had every legal right to remove a structure that violated its own bylaws. The bulldozer's engine roared to life, and within minutes its blade had torn through the shed's outer wall, sending splinters of gray wood scattering across the yard. Daniel watched without flinching as the machine pushed deeper, crumpling the tin roof and exposing the equipment that had been hidden beneath the floorboards for nearly 30 years. The pump was crushed within seconds, its casing folding under the blade's weight, followed almost immediately by the tangle of pipes that had carried water outward toward the rest of the neighborhood. The electrical panel controlling the entire system came apart next, sparks flashing briefly before the machine buried it beneath a pile of splintered lumber and broken concrete. The filtration unit followed, then the pressure regulator, then every last piece of wiring that had connected the buried well to the homes scattered across the community above it. Within 20 minutes, there was nothing left standing where the shed had once been, only a flattened mound of debris slowly settling in a cloud of dust beneath the morning sun. A small crowd of neighbors had gathered along the sidewalk to watch, several of them filming the demolition on their phones as though it were a minor spectacle worth remembering. Victoria walked among them, accepting congratulations from a few residents who thanked her for finally addressing what they called an embarrassment to the street. She smiled through each compliment, glancing occasionally toward Daniel, who remained near the fence line with his arms crossed, watching the destruction unfold without ever raising his voice. One neighbor asked her, half joking, whether she felt any guilt about tearing apart another man's property, and Victoria laughed the question off, insisting that rules existed precisely so that nobody's personal feelings could stand in the way of the greater good. Daniel walked forward once the machine had powered down, stepping carefully over broken boards until he reached a small metal box, half buried near where the shed's threshold used to stand. He knelt down, brushed away the dirt and splinters, and retrieved a single brass key that had, until moments earlier, been the last manual override for the entire underground system. He slipped it into his pocket, without a word to anyone, turned away from the wreckage, and walked back toward his house, leaving Victoria standing near the curb, admiring what she believed was a job well done. 48 hours passed before anyone in Willow Creek Estates noticed that anything had gone wrong. It began quietly, the way most disasters do, with a single homeowner turning on her kitchen faucet and finding only a faint hiss of air where water should have been. She assumed it was a temporary glitch, jiggled the handle a few times, and moved on with her morning without giving it much more thought. By that afternoon, however, similar complaints had begun trickling in from house after house scattered throughout the neighborhood. The count climbed steadily as the day wore on, with roughly 100 homes reporting dry taps by early evening, and that number nearly doubling again by the following morning. Panic began to spread through group messages and hurried conversations on front lawns, as residents compared notes and realized this was not an isolated plumbing problem confined to one street. By the second full day, the number had climbed past 200 homes, and by the time frightened calls started flooding the local water utility, it had reached close to 400 houses without a single working faucet between them. There was no water to drink, no water to bathe with, and perhaps most alarming of all, no water pressure available for a single fire hydrant anywhere within the development. Residents began calling anyone they could think of, dialing the Homeowners Association office, the municipal water department, and even the county government, desperate for someone to explain what had happened and how quickly it could be fixed. Nobody on the other end of those calls seemed to have any real answers, since the water utility insisted their own lines were functioning normally and had nothing to do with whatever was happening inside the private development. Victoria fielded a wave of furious phone calls herself, her confident tone from days earlier replaced by a defensive edge she tried hard to disguise. When residents pressed her for an explanation, she suggested, without much conviction, that the trouble likely originated somewhere within the city's own infrastructure, far outside anything the association could control. She repeated that theory to anyone who would listen, insisting that whatever was happening had nothing to do with a small, unremarkable shed that had been removed earlier that same week. Beneath her composed exterior, however, a small and uncomfortable question had begun to take root, one she was not yet ready to say out loud to herself or to anyone else. She pushed the thought away each time it surfaced, choosing instead to believe that the timing was nothing more than an unfortunate coincidence, a strange overlap of unrelated events that would sort itself out within a day or two. That belief would not survive much longer, not once the engineers arrived and began asking questions that Victoria had no idea how to answer. By the third day, the situation had grown desperate enough that a few residents began driving to a neighboring town to fill jugs and coolers with water hauled back for their families. Elderly residents who lived alone found themselves unable to manage the physical strain of carrying heavy containers up their driveways, relying instead on younger neighbors who volunteered to help however they could. A local restaurant offered free use of its restrooms to anyone passing through, and the small grocery store near the entrance to the development sold out of bottled water within hours of opening. Tempers grew short across the neighborhood, with arguments breaking out over whose fault the crisis truly was, long before anyone had gathered enough information to actually know the answer. City engineers arrived on the third day, dispatched after municipal officials grew tired of residents calling to report a water outage that seemed to have no source anywhere in the public system. A small team walked the neighborhood with tablets and testing equipment, tracing pipe routes, checking pressure valves, and comparing everything they found against old utility maps stored in the county archive. Within a few hours, one of the senior engineers pulled Victoria aside and told her something that made her stomach tighten considerably. The main water feed serving Willow Creek Estates, he explained, did not actually originate from any municipal source at all. Every home in the development had, for nearly 3 decades, been drawing its water from a private well system buried beneath a modest wooden structure near the back of one particular property. That structure, he continued, watching Victoria's expression shift from confusion to dawning horror, was the very shed the Homeowners Association had ordered demolished only days earlier. Old records soon surfaced from the county archive, confirming everything the engineers had already suspected. 30 years earlier, Daniel's father had donated a portion of his land, specifically to establish the well system, funding its construction almost entirely out of his own pocket during a period when the surrounding area still had no reliable water infrastructure of its own. In exchange for that generosity, the original developer had signed a formal agreement obligating the Homeowners Association, present and future, to maintain and protect the structure indefinitely, explicitly forbidding its removal under any circumstances. Victoria had never seen that document, had never even known it existed, since it had been filed away long before she moved into the neighborhood or joined the board. Nobody currently serving on the association had bothered to research the shed's history before voting to tear it down, content instead to rely on photographs of peeling paint and a crooked roofline. The engineers made it clear, in careful but unmistakable language, that the very structure everyone had mocked and dismissed was the single reason the entire community had ever had running water in the first place. One of the engineers, a man named Marcus Doyle, who had spent nearly 20 years working for the County Water Authority, sat down with Victoria in the association office and walked her through the paperwork line by line. He explained that agreements like the one Daniel's father had signed were not uncommon in developments built during periods of rapid growth, when private landowners often stepped in to fund infrastructure that public budgets could not yet cover. In exchange for that generosity, he continued, the agreements almost always included ironclad protections designed to prevent exactly the kind of situation now unfolding across Willow Creek Estates. Victoria listened in silence, staring at the faded signature at the bottom of the page, understanding for the first time just how completely her assumptions had been wrong. Word of the discovery spread through Willow Creek Estates faster than any official announcement could have managed on its own. Residents gathered near Daniel's property that same afternoon, drawn by rumors that the man they had barely acknowledged for years held the answers everyone desperately needed. Daniel met them without anger, spreading an old hand-drawn map across a folding table set up near the wreckage, tracing the path of pipes and valves with a steady finger while dozens of neighbors leaned in to listen. He explained the layout patiently, describing the depth of the well, the capacity of the pump, the role of the pressure regulator, and the long network of pipes that had quietly carried water beneath their lawns for nearly 30 years. A city engineer standing nearby confirmed everything Daniel said, adding that, without this particular system, the neighborhood had no secondary water source whatsoever, no backup plan of any kind to fall back on. Several residents exchanged uneasy glances, beginning to understand just how much they had all been relying on something they never once thought to ask about. The engineer went on to explain that rebuilding an equivalent system from scratch would likely cost several $1,000,000, factoring in new drilling, updated filtration equipment, and modern electrical infrastructure to replace everything the bulldozer had destroyed. Beyond the financial burden, he added, the process itself would likely stretch across many months, leaving the entire community without reliable water for far longer than anyone standing there could easily accept. A murmur of disbelief rippled through the crowd as the full weight of the situation began to settle over them. Emma Whitfield stood near the front of that gathering, listening intently as Daniel answered question after question with the same unhurried patience he had shown throughout the entire ordeal. She thought back to the meeting weeks earlier, to the small doubt she had swallowed rather than voiced, and felt a fresh wave of regret settle over her as she watched him trace the old pipe routes across his hand-drawn map. When he finished speaking, she stepped forward and asked quietly why he had never simply told the board everything from the very beginning, before any of this destruction had become necessary. Daniel considered the question for a long moment before answering that he had tried, more than once, but that some people only believe what they can see, and by the time they were willing to look closer, the shed was already gone. Victoria stood near the back of the gathering, her earlier composure completely gone, her arms crossed tightly as she listened to numbers and timelines that felt impossible to comprehend. She had approved the demolition, believing she was solving a cosmetic problem, a simple matter of appearances that would improve the neighborhood's curb appeal within a matter of weeks. Instead, she now understood, standing among neighbors whose faces had shifted from confusion to quiet fury, that she had personally authorized the destruction of the only thing keeping 400 homes supplied with water. Lawyers arrived within days, drawn by a situation that had quickly transformed from a neighborhood dispute into something with far larger legal implications. Attorneys representing several homeowners began combing through the association's old records, cross-referencing them against the original land agreement that Daniel's father had signed decades earlier. What they found painted an increasingly damaging picture of the decisions Victoria and the board had made in the days leading up to the demolition. The Homeowners Association, it became clear, had authorized the destruction of private property without ever verifying what that property actually contained. Beyond that, the board had violated a legally binding preservation agreement, explicitly prohibiting the removal of the well structure under any circumstances whatsoever. On top of the property violation, the association now faced accusations of destroying essential infrastructure that hundreds of families depended on for their most basic daily needs. Insurance companies representing the association reviewed the situation and quickly declined to cover any resulting damages, citing language in the policy that excluded intentional decisions made without proper due diligence. That refusal left the Homeowners Association financially exposed in a way none of its members had ever anticipated when they signed on to serve on the board. Residents who had lost days of water service, along with anyone forced to pay for emergency deliveries or temporary lodging elsewhere, began filing formal claims against the association almost immediately. An attorney representing a group of affected homeowners requested copies of every email and message Victoria had sent in the weeks leading up to the demolition, hoping to establish exactly how much she had known and when she had known it. What surfaced painted an unflattering picture of a woman who had dismissed multiple warnings without ever pausing to investigate them seriously. In one message, shared later among the plaintiffs, Victoria had written that Daniel was simply looking for sympathy and that his objections should be treated as nothing more than an inconvenience to be managed. That single message, intended as a private aside to a fellow board member, became one of the central pieces of evidence used to argue that the destruction had been reckless rather than merely mistaken. The legal proceedings dragged the association's internal affairs into a spotlight nobody on the board had ever wanted, exposing years of decisions made with far less care than residents had assumed. Financial records revealed that dues collected from homeowners had occasionally been spent on landscaping projects near the clubhouse, rather than on the infrastructure reviews that might have prevented this entire disaster. Auditors brought in by the court discovered that the association had not conducted a full utility survey in over a decade, relying instead on outdated maps that never once mentioned the well system buried beneath Daniel's property. Each new revelation chipped away further at whatever credibility the board had once held among the people it was supposed to serve. Board members who had voted alongside Victoria during that fateful meeting began resigning one after another, unwilling to attach their names any longer to a decision now drawing legal scrutiny from every direction. Some released statements distancing themselves from the vote entirely, insisting they had trusted Victoria's presentation without realizing how little research had actually gone into it. Victoria, once the most confident voice in every meeting, found herself increasingly isolated, fielding subpoenas and legal notices instead of compliments about the neighborhood's tidy appearance. The very authority she had wielded so freely just weeks earlier was slipping away from her with each passing day, replaced by a mounting stack of consequences she had never imagined facing. Neighbors who once nodded along with her strict interpretations of the association bylaws now avoided her entirely, unwilling to be associated with the woman responsible for the crisis engulfing their community. Victoria had spent years insisting that appearances mattered more than anything hidden beneath the surface, and now she was learning, in the most painful way possible, exactly how wrong that belief could be. She tried, in the early days of the fallout, to defend herself publicly, arguing that she had only followed a vote the entire board had approved, and that singling her out was unfair given how many people had raised their hands in favor. Few residents accepted that argument, pointing out that it had been Victoria who compiled the photographs, Victoria who dismissed every warning Daniel offered, and Victoria who pushed the vote through without allowing any real debate. A local news station picked up the story after a resident reached out to describe the situation, and within days reporters were parked outside the clubhouse asking questions Victoria had no comfortable way to answer. She stopped attending association functions altogether after that, retreating into her house and communicating only through her attorney whenever anyone tried to reach her. City officials approached Daniel roughly 2 weeks after the disaster began, arriving at his door with a proposal they hoped might resolve the crisis before it stretched on any longer. They explained that the municipality was prepared to fully rebuild the well housing, replacing everything the bulldozer had destroyed with modern equipment designed to last for generations. Beyond simple repairs, they wanted to upgrade the entire system, adding redundant pumps, advanced filtration, and a proper structure built specifically to withstand whatever the future might bring. More importantly, they proposed reclassifying the entire system as protected municipal infrastructure, removing it permanently from the reach of any future homeowners association. Daniel listened carefully to their offer, asking a few pointed questions about maintenance responsibilities and long-term oversight before finally agreeing to the terms they laid out. He set only one condition of his own, insisting that no homeowners association, now or in the future, would ever again hold any authority whatsoever over decisions affecting the water system beneath the neighborhood. The city agreed without hesitation, recognizing that the demand was more than reasonable given everything the community had just endured. Residents who gathered to hear the announcement responded with visible relief, many of them nodding along as officials explained exactly how the new arrangement would function going forward. Victoria, present at the meeting but no longer holding any real influence over its outcome, sat quietly near the back, unable to raise a single objection to terms that stripped away the very power she had once wielded so aggressively. Marcus Doyle, the engineer who had first uncovered the old agreement in the county archive, took a moment during the meeting to publicly thank Daniel for his years of quiet stewardship, noting that very few people would have maintained something so essential without ever asking for recognition. He explained to the gathered residents that the new system would include a formal maintenance contract, one that would finally compensate Daniel for the decades of unpaid labor he had contributed to keeping their community supplied with water. Daniel accepted the offer with a small nod, though he made clear that the money mattered far less to him than simply knowing the system would be properly protected going forward. Several residents applauded quietly at that response, a few of them exchanging glances that suggested they were only now beginning to understand the kind of man they had lived alongside for so many years, without ever truly knowing him. Her voice, once loud enough to dominate every association meeting for years, had effectively been silenced by the consequences of her own decisions. Nobody in the room seemed interested in hearing her perspective any longer. Their attention instead fixed entirely on Daniel and the officials laying out a plan to finally set things right. For the first time in longer than anyone could remember, decisions about the neighborhood's most essential resource were being made by people who actually understood what was at stake. Construction crews began work within the month, rebuilding the well housing with reinforced materials designed to outlast anything that had come before it. The new pump ran quieter and more efficiently than the old one ever had, paired with a filtration system that exceeded every modern safety standard the engineers could find. Backup generators were installed alongside the primary equipment, ensuring that even a prolonged power outage would never again leave the neighborhood without water. Sensors and monitoring equipment were wired throughout the system, allowing problems to be detected and addressed long before they could ever escalate into another crisis. When the work was finally finished, city officials arranged a small ceremony near the site where the original shed had once stood, inviting residents to gather and see the finished project for themselves. A modest plaque had been mounted near the entrance, engraved with words explaining that the community's water supply had been quietly maintained for decades through the dedication of one family, without asking for recognition or reward. Neighbors who had once laughed at photographs of peeling paint and crooked rooflines now stood in respectful silence, reading those words carefully before turning to look at Daniel standing nearby. Walter, the same neighbor who had spoken up during the original meeting to call the shed nothing more than a shed, approached Daniel near the edge of the crowd and offered a quiet apology for not pushing harder against the vote that day. Daniel accepted it graciously, telling him that hindsight made critics of everyone eventually, and that he held no particular grudge against people who had simply trusted a process they assumed was working correctly. Walter admitted that he had assumed, like most of his neighbors, that a structure so unremarkable could not possibly matter as much as Daniel kept insisting it did. He said he would not make that mistake again, and that from now on he intended to ask more questions before agreeing to anything the board proposed, regardless of how confident the presentation sounded. Emma Whitfield stood near the plaque long after most of the other residents had drifted back toward their cars, tracing the engraved letters with her fingers as she read the inscription a second time. She thought again of the doubt she had swallowed weeks earlier, the small voice that had urged her to speak up before the vote was finalized, and resolved quietly that she would not stay silent again the next time something felt wrong. Daniel noticed her lingering and walked over, telling her gently that regret was only useful if it changed how a person acted afterward, and that she had plenty of time ahead to prove that lesson had taken root. She smiled at that, thanked him for his patience with all of them, and asked if he might be willing to explain the new monitoring system sometime, since she wanted to understand it properly this time around. Victoria did not attend the ceremony that day. In the weeks following the disaster, she had been removed from her position as president, voted out by an association eager to distance itself from everything her leadership had caused. Multiple lawsuits from affected residents remained pending against her personally, each one seeking compensation for damages tied directly to decisions she had pushed through with such confidence. Facing mounting legal fees she had no way to avoid, she ultimately made the difficult decision to sell her home and relocate somewhere far from the community she had once ruled so tightly. A moving truck arrived at her house on a quiet weekday morning, drawing a few curious glances from neighbors who paused their errands to watch her carry the last of her belongings out the front door. Nobody stopped to say goodbye, and nobody offered to help, a silence that spoke louder than any confrontation could have managed. Victoria paused once on the front steps, glancing down the street toward the spot where the new well housing now stood, its clean white walls a sharp contrast to the crooked gray shed she had once found so offensive. She got into her car without another word, pulling away from Willow Creek Estates for the final time, leaving behind a reputation she would spend years trying to rebuild somewhere else entirely. Daniel, for his part, returned to the same quiet life he had always preferred, largely unchanged by the recognition suddenly surrounding him. He walked into the newly built structure on its first morning of operation, checking gauges and settings with the same careful attention he had always given the old system before it. Before locking the door behind him, he placed the small brass key, the same one he had pulled from the wreckage weeks earlier, onto a shelf near the entrance, a quiet reminder of everything the community had nearly lost. Clean water soon began flowing steadily through pipes, reaching more than 400 homes once again, filling faucets and showers that had sat dry for far too long. Nobody in Willow Creek Estates ever referred to that small structure as an eyesore again, not after everything they had learned about what it had quietly protected for nearly 30 years. Instead, they spoke of it the way people speak of something they finally understand deserves respect, a modest building that had silently kept an entire community alive through decades nobody had ever bothered to notice. The new Homeowners Association Board, formed only weeks after Victoria's departure, adopted a policy requiring a full utility review before any structure on any property could be approved for demolition, regardless of how minor the request seemed. Board meetings grew noticeably quieter after that, with members taking far more time to research issues before casting votes that once would have passed within minutes on nothing more than a glance at a photograph. Residents who attended those meetings noticed the shift immediately, remarking that decisions now came slower, but that slower decisions seemed to carry far less risk of the kind of disaster they had all just lived through. Nobody complained about the extra paperwork, since everyone in the neighborhood understood exactly what carelessness had cost them the first time around. Daniel continued his same quiet routine each morning, walking the familiar path along the back fence with his thermos of black coffee, though now the structure he approached bore little resemblance to the shed his father had originally built. He still stopped at the same spot for the same amount of time, checking gauges that were newer and more precise than anything the old system had ever offered, but the ritual itself remained exactly as it always had been. Occasionally, a neighbor would walk by and wave, sometimes stopping to ask a question about the system, or simply to thank him again for everything he had quietly done for so many years, without ever asking for credit. Daniel always answered patiently, never rushing the conversation, understanding now that the invisibility he once preferred had given way to something else, a kind of trust built slowly out of crisis, and finally out of understanding. Seasons passed, and the drought that had gripped the region eventually eased, though residents of Willow Creek Estates never again took their water supply for granted the way they once had. Visitors touring homes for sale in the neighborhood sometimes asked about the modest plaque near the well housing, and current residents would explain the story with a kind of quiet pride, describing a man who had protected something essential for decades without ever needing anyone to notice. The tale spread slowly through the town beyond the development itself, told and retold at community gatherings, until it became something closer to local legend than simple neighborhood history. Through it all, Daniel remained exactly the same, still checking his gauges each morning, still keeping the small brass key on its shelf near the entrance, a quiet man who had never once needed the world to understand him in order to keep doing what he believed was right.